Our next speaker is going to be Damen Ratliff. Damen is the Assistant Director of Utilities for the City of Amarillo. He worked for the city for 23 years in various capacities. He started in the water production and water transmission divisions where he learned the importance of groundwater. David also has been working closely with the City of Amarillo's wastewater treatment facilities to facilitate water reclamation program. Damen also closely works to maximize the environmental impact and promote water conservation for the Texas Panhandle. Join me in welcoming Damen.
So hopefully they'll get the slides going here. My name is Damen Ratliff. I work for the City of Amarillo. I've been there for 23 years. And I've kind of done a little bit of everything in the utilities business. So I started off out in the well field, pulling and setting wells, and kind of worked my way through wastewater. And now I'm back in utilities. I had a little hiatus. I took off and went to drainage utility for a little bit, and I figured this is home, so I came back. There we go. So there's my information there, just in case after this is over you have questions or something like that that comes up. I think that water conservation ends up being something that we talk about, especially with the farm, agriculture stuff that we have going around here, and all of the other things that are happening around the Texas Panhandle, knowing what's going on with the aquifer and also with Lake Meredith. But I will tell you that the city is very interested in conservation. Just like we were talking about, there's lots of money that can come into the city of Amarillo from the bumper crops and things like that that could happen out with cotton and corn and hemp and all the things we've talked about today. It actually does have a huge impact on the city of Amarillo. And I do want to take a chance real quick just to say that I'm really happy to see that there are our next generation of water deciders in the room. I think it's pretty interesting that we have younger generation sitting in the room, and so I want everybody to kind of give you all a round of applause if you don't mind. So water recycling is critical in managing our water resources through water conservation and water recycling. We can meet environmental needs and still have sustainable development and a viable economy. And that was by Felicia Morris, Regional Administrator of the EPA. And I think that we've heard on multiple occasions already today that the history of the aquifer and Lake Meredith in the Texas Panhandle has a huge impact on everything that we do. In fact, earlier we were talking about Dr. Moore, or Dr. Mace said that without the aquifer, we don't think that there would have been much development on the plains. And so that's a really big deal. I also thought it was interesting, too, that Wade had talked about water coming from the Ogallala Aquifer is being used at a much higher rate than it is across the rest of the state, which means that we are the stewards of this area and we need to take care of the resources that we have. And I think the city of Amarillo is absolutely interested in making sure that we meet those demands. So what is wastewater reuse? I wanted to kind of give just a little bit of history here, but anyway, reuse defined by the EPA is using wastewater for anything other than just a purpose, right? And so if we were just going to discharge it to a creek, that is one purpose, but if we reuse it for another purpose, like irrigation of crops or selling it to someone else for their use, I'm really interested in this hemp thing, that there's an opportunity there. It's a pretty robust crop. It doesn't sound like it needs a lot of antibiotic, and so it sounds like it might be a good fit for wastewater reuse. The big problem with wastewater reuse is there is a stigma that goes along with wastewater, right? So nobody wants to touch the poo water. Nobody wants to drink the poo water. And so there is a stigma that goes along with that. And so on this slide, it's kind of like the life cycle of water reuse. It kind of starts with our resource management. We have to kind of jump through some hoops for regulation. We also have to look at some normalization, standardization of what it is that we're actually trying to do. Obviously, we have to treat that wastewater. We have to think about public hygiene and health. And then we have to talk about, is it even financially stable or feasible for us to go and use wastewater? And then we have to operate that system, and then we have to find some way at the end of it, and this always seems like it's an afterthought, is the acceptance of using it. And so I'm sure most of y'all have heard there are cities out there that are doing direct potable reuse. And so you look at Wichita Falls, you look at El Paso, those communities are already doing that. And I think somewhere in the future, Amarillo may be thinking about those things, but right now we have we have a method for our wastewater. So the most common reasons are trying to find ways that we don't end up eating through all of our potable water that's floating around out there that we have today. And so we want to stave that off. And I think that that's the final message for what we're going to talk about today. When I get to the end of this, I promise we're going to talk about what impact this actually has on the city of Amarillo and the Texas Panhandle. There's different types of reuses. Obviously, urban reuse. There are a lot of different places that are starting to get into using treated wastewater for lots of different things. You can use it on golf courses. You can use it in parks. The city of Amarillo does this now. We have a pipeline that goes from our Hollywood Road wastewater treatment plant to the golf course. We can fill their ponds. We can also use it for irrigation out there if we needed to. There's some agricultural reuse. We've already talked about the demand for agricultural use in the Texas Panhandle. And so any non-food crops right now, we could actually use it for that. And we'll talk about advantages and disadvantages here in a second. Recreational impoundments such as lakes and ponds. We can also help with increased flows in streams. We've seen that too. If you think about the streams that are going around, we're using most of the water that's going through those streams. And now the flows have started to drop off, and this is another way that we can get some of that back. And then industrial reuse, which is how the city of Amarillo is primarily using ours today. So there is one critical step, though, in this process. It needs to be treated to such a level where it doesn't cause problems for the general public. Obviously, there's some contaminants that are floating around in wastewater, and if we don't take care of that, then those things get compounded as we start to send it out into the system. And so the state, TCEQ, EPA are very interested in making sure that if there is some type of reuse for wastewater, that it's treated to a point where people won't get sick. So, but there are lots of historical examples of people using treated wastewater. And part of it is it's been diluted by rainwater. This happened all the way back 3000 BC. They were diluting it with rainwater and sand, filtering that and reusing it for their crops and other things. Mexico's been using it for agricultural things. Anything that's going to be distilled, i.e. tequila, whiskey, those type things like that. If it's going to be cooked, you can use wastewater for those things. On and on, right? But most recently in Japan, one of the big pushes is that they're running a separate set of lines around their towns. They're actually putting in reclaimed water lines, and that's just for flushing your toilet, or just for irrigation of your plants, or watering your lawn and things like that. And it's become a pretty good model. It's starting to take off a little bit in Europe too. There's a couple of cities that are starting to use that. So there are some constituents that need to be taken out of wastewater in order to make it where it's safe for people. And part of those, I mean, if you're in the water and sewer industry, you know about TSS and BOD and COD. But the big thing is, too, is that there's a few things that are still floating around out there, like metals that are really, really hard to treat. And VOCs are another thing, too, that become difficult to get out of our wastewater streams. And so the technology is there. We're starting to move forward, and we can actually see different ways to treat a lot of this stuff out of the wastewater. So there's some problems with it, too, and I'm going to talk about this specifically with our contract and our partnership that we have with Excel. But there is the potential for groundwater contamination with nitrate and nitrites. Antibiotics aren't as effective if you're using this as a watering source for your plants. That's why, they were talking this morning about hemp. It's really neat. They're talking about how hardy it really is and how little water it takes. And so this makes it a good match for, reuse or reclamation. Sometimes wastewater can have a little bit of an odor. Typically after it's treated, that's not there. At the most, you might get a little bit of a musty smell, but at the end of it, that's all. But the industrial side of this thing is that since there's still nutrient that's floating around in some of that wastewater, it causes some serious problems. For Excel, they have cooling towers, and that's where we sell a lot of our wastewater, retreated wastewater. And one of the issues that they have out there is that the scaling on the inside of their cooling tower. So as it steams off, the scale sticks to the walls, and that is what was left over out of the treatment process that didn't get taken out. So major advantages are that, for one, it limits our use of our potable water, right? And so, again, I'm going to get to this at some point where how much water are we actually using and how much water are we selling. versus how much we could be saving ourselves by making sure that this is the process that we continue to do. Our capital cost is typically pretty low. The treatment process is already in place. All we're doing is just taking the water that comes out of that and selling it to somebody else so that way they can reuse it in a different method. Operation and maintenance is pretty simple. Again, we don't normally have to add a whole lot of work to our process in order to make it work. And then the provisions of nutrient-rich wastewaters are actually good for certain areas. And so in most cases, the quality of the wastewater and irrigation supply is better than that of some of the well water. Anybody around here ever drilled a well and then you come back with brackish water, gyp water, things like that? Plants and things don't normally like that type of water, and so there is the possibility that we can, supply a better quality water than what we can get from different areas in the aquifer. So disadvantages, if implemented on a large scale, that the revenues that come off of that are really going to be used back for this, but it also may fall into a category where it cuts our own throats, if you will, and I don't want to say that facetiously, but if we sell a lot of reclaimed water, then we're not going to be selling as much potable water. So as a municipality, there's a conflict of interest on both sides of this thing. We want to conserve, but at the same time, over-conservation means that we don't have revenue, right? And so we have to kind of make sure that we're using it in such a method that it's beneficial on both parties. So reuse of wastewater is really seasonal, and I'll show that here in just a little bit on a slide where we talk about in the summertime, when the peak demand is up for XL, we sell them a whole lot more water than we do in the wintertime when the demand's not as high. But in some cases, reuse of wastewater is not economically even feasible. And so when we start talking, or when I'm talking about farming or using it for hemp irrigation, maybe even cotton irrigation, things like that, it may not be worth it for me to run the pipeline to your property just so that way you can get this water. And so we need to think about some things like that. And then application of untreated wastewater as irrigation water or injected into our groundwater areas can cause serious contamination. And so we have to be really, really careful about how we do that too. And so how does the city of Amarillo actually fit into this? This is kind of the meat and potatoes of this. But anyway, the city of Amarillo has 2 wastewater treatment plants. We have the Hollywood Road plant, which is south of town. We have the River Road plant, which is north of town. And so Hollywood Road was built in 1963. Anyway, its original discharge for the wastewater effluent was irrigation of a nearby playa lake, and it was only rated for about 4.5 million gallons a day. And so since 1963, the city of Amarillo has grown, which means that so is our wastewater. And so the plant was expanded in 1977, gave it an 8 million gallon rating, and then in 1988, Hollywood Road started discharging to Lake Tanglewood. And we stopped putting it into the playa lake, and we stopped using it for any type of irrigation, and it went directly through Lake Tanglewood, which, believe it or not, is a good thing. It kept the lake full, kept things going, everything like that, but it also had some unique challenges. Part of it was how do we get it there? But anyway, in 1992, the plant was upgraded again, gave us a rating of 12 million gallons a day, and in 2006, in a partnership with XL, there was a pipeline that was put in that ran from Hollywood Road all the way out to the Nichols power plant. And that way they could get our effluent for cooling towers. This is what the plant looked like at the beginning. You can see the playa lake. We were joking around earlier today that playa lake hasn't looked like that in a really long time. Part of it is we just haven't had the rain. Number 2, that's not our discharge point anymore. So, but anyway, that was the primary place where the water went. And so, anyway, things have changed just a little bit. River Road, this was the first wastewater treatment plant in Amarillo. Before 1927, they were just lagoons. And so the wastewater would go, they would sit in the lagoon, and whenever it left, it went into a creek that was, I think the North Amarillo Creek is what that was. The plant was actually built in 1927. When the plant was built, it was a really, really simple process. So, but anyway, they modernized it, and they put a rating of about 4.5 million gallons a day, and that happened in 1955. And in 1960, SPS decided that they wanted to build the Nichols power plant. And with that being said, and that was the beginning of our partnership with XL. We were selling most of that water to Texaco for the refinery that was here in Amarillo. And whenever XL decided they were going to do that, was kind of the decline of the refinery in Amarillo. And so we started laying pipelines. Anyway, 1968, the plant was expanded to 12 million gallons, and in 1977, there was a pump station that was put in and a 27-inch line that went directly to SPS for the Nichols cooling station. And anyway, by March of 1977, a new pump station and pipeline was built in order to sell all of our effluent to industry. And so that is the case today, that 100%, I say this relative, we have small obligations to a ranch, and we also have obligations to TCEQ that we have to be able to discharge to creek at some point during the year so that way we can do permitting. But anyway, almost everything else we have the ability to get it to the Nichols power plant. But anyway, in February 1986, they completed one last expansion that got it to about 16 million gallons a day. And this is what the plant looks like currently. The water would actually go north through this picture, and it leaves that last little portion, goes out to the creek that you can see on the left-hand side, and that used to be our permitted discharge. It still is permitted discharge, but most of the water that we have out there goes to the Nichols power plant. So the city of Amarillo had a reuse contract since 1955, which means that we were kind of on the cutting edge of water reclamation and water reuse, which is good. In 1977, the city started selling its reclaimed water to SPS. And when the Nichols plant was built, SPS needed that effluent for supplementing their cooling waters. Before that, SPS would mix our reclaimed water with well water, and then it would go through the process of cooling their towers. And they would get a couple of cycles out of that before they had to get rid of that, to which they were using it for irrigation. And that becomes important here in just a second. In 2006, like I said, the city of Amarillo collaborated with XL. We laid about a 14-mile pipeline that went from the south side of the loop all the way north to the Nichols Harrington stations. And so they had to put in a few other improvements there. We didn't have a pump station that could pump that water. The head on that line is pretty high. And so they had to put in a brand new pump station, which is what that bottom left picture is. And also, too, we had some new requirements that we had to meet. So the water quality needed to change just a little bit, and so they put in a re-aeration process at the end of our treatment plant, which actually helped us in the long run. This is a picture of what that pipeline looks like. On the southeast side of Amarillo, you can see where it says Hollywood Road Wastewater Reclamation Facility, and then there's a purple line that goes north. And where the line from the north and the line from the south intersect, there's a little yellow circle, and that would be where the Nichols Herring power stations are. And so you can see that's a pretty substantial pipeline that had to go in order to get that effluent out there to them. So, but in 2006, SPS traded some of the groundwater rights to the city of Amarillo in exchange for almost all of our effluent. We still had some obligations, like I said, to TCEQ and also the Curry Ranch. But in recent years, nitrates have become an issue for SPS. Right? And so with their land application process, what was happening was TCEQ comes out, wants to know what the land application looks like, takes some soil samples, and realized that nitrate levels were pretty high. For us, we were just looking at it earlier today, our original nitrate levels on average were right around 21 parts per million, which is pretty high. In the proposed new direction that we're going with them, we will try to get that down to 5 parts per million. That's a pretty big undertaking to do. So both of the plants will be upgraded. We're going to start running what's called an anoxic zone at the beginning of our aeration basins. And what that does is it creates an ammonia spike, and then we aerate, and along with that ammonia drop, the nitrates go away with that too. And so it gives us a better quality effluent that's coming out of the plant that actually goes to XL or SPS, so that way it helps with some of their discharge processes too. So anyway, this is what our flows look like from Hollywood and River Road. These are in million gallons a month until you get down to the totals down there, and this is where the conservation part really becomes important. So as we go through it, it looks like Hollywood Road does about 1.8 billion gallons a year, and River Road does about 1 billion gallons a year, a little over 1 billion gallons a year. It's quite a bit of water that goes that way. And so if we put that into perspective, what that means is in 2019, we sold over 2.9 billion gallons of reclaimed water to SPS. That is a huge amount of water. If SPS uses that water just 4 times, which typically it's only 2, but they can go up to 4, if they use it 4 times, then that equates to 11.6 billion gallons of water. That's an average of 35,599 acre-feet of water that doesn't have to come from the aquifer or from Lake Meredith. That's a pretty substantial savings in water. If we take their total usage, let's say they used it 4 times every time that the water went through there, that would equate to 1/7 of the total volume of Lake Meredith, according to yesterday's number. I hope I'm right, Ken. So, but according to yesterday's numbers. And if we just take the water that we sold them, just the water that we sold, it's 1/28 of the total volume of Lake Meredith that's being saved every single year. That's a pretty impressive amount of savings across the Panhandle. And so, again, like I said, the city of Amarillo really is interested in conservation, and we want to save that as much as we possibly can. Now, there are some things that are coming down the road. The future is probably going to be direct potable reuse, which is typically where the wastewater ends up being run through a membrane. It's treated to a really high level, and then we can put that back at the beginning of our water treatment plant, and then we can start reusing that for our potable water process. Now, whether or not we can get enough buy-in from people to believe that that's a good process, we'll see. There's some really interesting debates going on around the state right now about what that looks like. Also, too, there is the potential for aquifer storage. We talked a little bit earlier about, water doesn't move horizontally very quickly in the aquifer. And so if we put that water in there and it's treated to a really high level, then we may be able to come back in 50 years and reuse that water. And so that is a really cool process to look at a way to try to supplement how the aquifer is working today. So the other thing that I did want to mention too is that Sarah Schlesinger had talked about educating our population, right? And so she said that our population is going to increase 70% over the next 50 years. And if we don't have a plan to use this water or to conserve this water today, what will it look like in the future? I mean, there was a pretty good debate while the aquifer history and the aquifer modeling presentations were going on about, how do we know what that actually looks like somewhere in the future? And so we can estimate, we can guesstimate, we can pontificate. How many more 8s can I add there? But we can look at it lots and lots of different ways, but at the end of the day, we don't know what that's going to look like. And so we have to educate people. We have to let them know that technically you're drinking the poo water now, right? So there's a lot of biological mitigators between us and that, but the truth is that it's already happening. I was trying to explain this to my wife last night, and I'm originally from St. Louis, Missouri. And I asked her, I said, how many people do you think upstream of the city of St. Louis are actually dumping wastewater or some other type of contaminant into that river? And guess where they get their water source from? And she goes, ew, gross. And I was like, it's really not that bad. The treatment process is pretty good. And so knowing that we can treat it to a point where we can use it somewhere down the road makes it a really good option for Amarillo and the Texas Panhandle. So I will tell you that I know over lots of research that the ability to reuse and recycle wastewater is a very viable option. And I'm glad that the city of Amarillo has been in this game for quite a while. I will tell you that it's a successful way to conserve water for the future. And if we start moving in the direction of direct potable reuse or aquifer storage, that actually helps us in the long run. And it gives not only our kids, but our grandkids and their kids an opportunity to still have lots of water whenever they get to the point where we are. So, y'all have any questions for me? No? I'll take it. Thank you for your time.